At 5:45 a.m. on July 7, 1944, Marine Sergeant Thomas Gunner O'Neill knelt alone behind an M1919A4 Browning machine gun in a depression known as Hell's Pocket, Saipan. He was staring down the final wave of the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. The 25-year-old O'Neill commanded a single gun position. 2 hours ago he had a loader and a squad. Now his loader was dead. The squad was gone. O'Neill was the sole operator of a weapon designed for a 3-man crew. The M1919A4 weighed 31 pounds. Air-cooled. Cyclic rate, 500 rounds per minute. Belt-fed .30-06 Springfield ammunition. The gun had been firing continuously since 0400. The barrel was glowing cherry red against the jungle darkness. The perforated cooling jacket was hissing from the heat. O'Neill had 2 cloth belts remaining, approximately 60 seconds of sustained fire. Captain Hiroshi Sato and his suicide squad were 50 yards away and closing fast. The orders were absolute. Hold this pocket. If the pocket falls, the 105th Infantry Regiment gets flanked. If the regiment breaks, the American beachhead collapses. If Saipan is lost, the B-29s cannot reach Tokyo. O'Neill held. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Back to O'Neill. Thomas O'Neill was born November 12, 1918 in Detroit, Michigan. Motor City. His father was an assembly line foreman at Ford. His mother was a seamstress. The family understood machinery. O'Neill attended Cass Technical High School. He wasn't a scholar. He was a mechanic. He understood friction, heat, and tolerance. He graduated in 1936 and went straight to the assembly line. He spent 5 years building engines, learning that a machine only works if you respect its limits. In January 1942, weeks after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The Marines didn't just need riflemen, they needed technicians of war. Boot camp at San Diego Recruit Depot honed his body, but the machine gun school turned him into a weapon. O'Neill was assigned the M1919A4 Browning. This weapon would decide his fate 2 years later. Designed by John Moses Browning, it was the lighter, air-cooled cousin of the heavy water-cooled M1917. The gun itself weighed 31 pounds. The M2 tripod added another 14 pounds. It fired the standard .30-06 cartridge, a 150-grain bullet leaving the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. Unlike the water-cooled guns that could fire forever, the air-cooled M1919 relied on airflow to prevent the barrel from warping. It wasn't designed for sustained, 2-hour defensive fire. It was designed for short, aggressive bursts. O'Neill would have to push it past the failure point. By July 1944, O'Neill was a sergeant in the 2nd Battalion. He was deployed to Saipan, the D-Day of the Pacific. Saipan was critical. It was 1,500 miles from Tokyo, within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. The Japanese knew this. Defending the island was Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. His order to his troops was simple: every man will kill 10 Americans before dying. By July 6, the battle was lost for Japan, but the killing wasn't over. General Saito issued the order for Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. A total suicide charge. The target was the American Gap at Tanapag Plain. O'Neill was positioned at Hell's Pocket, a tactical choke point overlooking the plain. He spent the night of July 6 prepping. He dug in. He set crossing sticks to limit his traverse in the dark. He cleaned the bolt assembly 3 times. He knew something was coming. Intelligence reported 3,000 Japanese soldiers gathering in the ravine. At 0400 hours, a red signal flare cut through the dark. A low roar began in the jungle, sounding like a stadium crowd. Then came the whistle. The jungle floor started to move. Leading them was Captain Hiroshi Sato, sword drawn. The math was simple: 3,000 men against 1 overheating gun. Thomas O'Neill didn't grow up learning how to kill. He grew up learning how things worked. In the industrial heart of 1930s Detroit, the rhythm of life was the rhythm of the assembly line. He spent his days at the River Rouge complex, surrounded by the smell of ozone, hot grease, and grinding steel. He learned early on that metal has a temper. Push a piston too hard without oil and it seizes. Overheat a gear and it warps. For O'Neill, this wasn't just labor. It was a fundamental education in thermodynamics that the Marine Corps couldn't teach. He understood that every machine, no matter how powerful, has a breaking point. When the war came, the Corps recognized his aptitude for mechanics. They didn't just hand him a rifle, they assigned him the M1919A4 light machine gun. In training, the instructors were blunt about the job description. "You are the backbone of the squad," they told him, "and you are the first man the enemy will try to kill." A machine gunner draws fire like a magnet. In a firefight, the enemy sniper always scans for the tripod first. The survival rate for a gunner in an exposed position was often measured in minutes, not hours. O'Neill accepted the math. He treated his survival as an engineering problem. Efficiency equaled life. The tool of his trade was a beast of deceptive simplicity. The Browning M1919A4 was an air-cooled, recoil-operated machine gun weighing exactly 31 pounds. Unlike the heavy, water-cooled M1917S that could fire indefinitely, the 19 relied entirely on air passing through a perforated steel jacket to cool the barrel. It fired the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge at a cyclic rate of 400 to 550 rounds per minute. O'Neill mastered the concept of the beaten zone, the elliptical patch of ground where the cone of fire strikes. He learned not to aim at individual men, but to aim at space, creating a wall of lead that nothing biological could pass through. But he also knew the weapon's fatal flaw. Without a water jacket, sustained fire would turn the barrel white-hot and useless in minutes. Fire discipline wasn't just a rule, it was physics. On June 15, 1944, O'Neill dragged his tripod onto the coarse sand of Saipan. The invasion was massive, the D-Day of the Pacific. But the Marianas were different. This wasn't a jungle skirmish, it was the doorstep to the Japanese homeland. The Japanese defenders, dug into the limestone caves and coral ridges, weren't fighting for territory. They were fighting for time. As the Marines pushed inland through the grueling heat, a brutal reality set in. The enemy wasn't surrendering. They were choosing death over capture, fighting with a ferocity that defied Western logic. By early July, the American forces had compressed the Imperial Japanese Army into the northern tip of the island. The enemy was cornered, starving, and cut off from supply. O'Neill assumed the victory was inevitable and the hard fighting was over. He was wrong. As the sun set on July 6, deep in a ravine just a mile from O'Neill's foxhole, a ragged Japanese officer named Captain Sato was gathering the wounded for a final meeting that would change the history of the Pacific War. Captain Hiroshi Sato sat in the humid, suffocating darkness of a limestone cave north of Tanapak. His uniform, once the crisp khaki of the Imperial Japanese Army, was stained with the red clay of Saipan and the dried blood of his own men. A shrapnel wound in his left thigh throbbed in time with the distant tremor of American naval bombardment, but pain had become irrelevant. The logic of survival had been replaced by the logic of sacrifice. Sato checked the action of his Nambu pistol. It was clean. It was ready. The battle for Saipan was mathematically over. The American invasion force had severed the Japanese supply lines and pushed the defenders to the northern cliffs. But General Yoshitsugu Saito, the aging commander of the island's defense, had issued his final decree before preparing for his own ritual suicide. There would be no surrender. There would be no retreat. The order was Gyokusai, to shatter like a beautiful jewel rather than remain intact like a common tile. It was a command for total, glorious annihilation. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death, the general's order read. However, in death there is life. We will advance to attack the American forces and will all die together. Sato stood up to inspect the force he was about to lead into oblivion. It was an army of ghosts. These were not the fresh, elite shock troops of 1941. They were the starving remnants of broken battalions, huddled together in the ravine. Men with gangrenous limbs leaned heavily against the wet cave walls. Soldiers who had lost their Arisaka rifles sat on the ground, sharpening bamboo poles into crude spears. The desperation was absolute. Sato moved among them, distributing the last of the ordnance. A soldier with a bandaged head was given a Type 99 grenade. A man on crutches was given a bayonet lashed to a stick. Their instructions were simple: if you can walk, you charge. If you can crawl, you charge. The tactical objective was desperate but precise. Sato studied the captured American map. The enemy line had a seam near the coast, held by the 105th Infantry Regiment. It was a gap in the terrain, a depression that led directly to the American artillery positions in the rear. If Sato could drive a wedge there, his men could massacre the gun crews and die, causing maximum chaos. He didn't know the name of the man guarding the perimeter at that specific gap. He didn't know about the mechanic from Detroit or the air-cooled Browning M1919A4 sitting on its tripod. He only knew that the American position was the gate, and his body was the battering ram. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Sato tied his family's sword to his waist. He believed the Americans would be sleeping, complacent in their victory. He was right about most of them. But in a muddy foxhole 400 yards away, Sergeant O'Neill was wide awake, and the jungle silence was about to be broken by a sound that no training manual had ever described. The terrain dictated the tactics, and the terrain at Hell's Pocket was a death trap. It was a narrow depression in the coral landscape, a natural funnel running between the ridges that led straight to the American rear. If the Japanese were going to break out, they would have to pour through here like water through a broken dam. Sergeant O'Neill understood this instantly. He wasn't looking at a landscape, he was looking at a fatal geometry. He spent the early hours of the night engineering his position. The darkness was absolute, pressing against the eyes like a physical weight, so O'Neill had to rely on touch and muscle memory. He hammered 2 wooden stakes into the ground on either side of the M1919A4's barrel. These were his crossing sticks. In the chaos of a night fight, when muzzle flashes blinded you and fear disoriented you, the sticks were the failsafe. If he swung the gun left, the barrel would hit the wood, stopping him from firing into the foxhole of the rifleman next to him. If he swung right, the other stick stopped him. Between the wood lay the kill zone, a fixed lane of grazing fire set at knee height. Anything that walked between those sticks would be cut down without O'Neill ever having to see it. Beside him, Private First Class Miller was unraveling. The young loader was fumbling with the ammo boxes, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The humidity was oppressive, turning the air into a wet blanket that smelled of rotting vegetation and cordite. Miller dropped a canister of oil, the metal clatter sounding like a gunshot in the silence. "Easy," O'Neill whispered. He didn't offer platitudes. He offered work. "Strip the bolt." "Sarge, I can't see a damn thing," Miller hissed. "You don't need to see. Use your hands." O'Neill reached over and guided Miller's hands to the backplate. "It's just a machine, Miller. Springs, levers, and steel. If the machine works, we work." For the next hour, they sat in the dark, ritually stripping and reassembling the weapon. O'Neill ran his thumb over the extractor and the sear, checking for grit. He oiled the slide. He checked the headspace on the barrel, ensuring the cartridge would seat perfectly. It was a meditation in mechanics that slowly lowered Miller's heart rate. By midnight, the gun was reassembled, cold and slick with oil, a dormant beast waiting for a spark. At 0300 hours, the dynamic changed. A runner from the command post crawled into their position, whispering urgency. "G2 says they're moving. Big movement. Sensors are tripping all along the ravine." O'Neill nodded, shifting his weight behind the tripod. He unlocked the traversing mechanism. He fed the brass tab of the first 250-round cloth belt into the receiver and racked the charging handle twice. Clack clack. The sound was final. Then the jungle went wrong. The insects, which had been buzzing in a deafening nightly chorus, suddenly stopped. The wind died. The rustling of the palm fronds ceased. It was a vacuum of sound, a heavy, suffocating silence that felt artificial. It wasn't empty, it was holding its breath. O'Neill peered over the iron sights into the black void of the ravine. He couldn't see them, but he could feel the mass of thousands of men moving just beyond the visual horizon, compressing the air in front of them. The silence stretched for minutes, tight as a piano wire, until O'Neill saw a single spark rise from the tree line, not a firefly but the hissing arc of a red signal flare. At 0400 hours, the suspense shattered. The red flare hung in the sky, casting a sickly crimson light over the ravine, and the vacuum of silence was instantly filled by a sound that defied human understanding. It didn't sound like an army, it sounded like a natural disaster. Thousands of throats screamed in unison, "Tenahika Banzai." A wall of noise that hit O'Neill with the physical force of a blast wave. It was the roar of a stadium crowd, but twisted into a manic, death-seeking frenzy. Then they appeared. Out of the smoke and shadows of the Tanapag plain, the first wave materialized. It wasn't a tactical advance. There was no cover and move, no probing for flanks. It was a stampede. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, some armed with rifles, others with spears or grenades lashed to bamboo poles, surged forward in a tight, heaving mass. They were running straight up the funnel of the depression, directly into the kill zone O'Neill had surveyed only hours before. O'Neill didn't panic, he went to work. He gripped the pistol grip, depressed the butterfly trigger, and the M1919A4 roared to life. He didn't hold the trigger down. Continuous fire would warp the barrel in 60 seconds. Instead, he fired in disciplined, rhythmic bursts, 6 to 9 rounds at a time. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Pause. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Pause. It was a mechanical cadence, a grim heartbeat of steel. The tracers, loaded every fifth round in the cloth belt, streaked out like laser beams, punching holes through the darkness. The physics of the beaten zone took over. The heavy .30-06 rounds tore through the front ranks, tumbling and shattering bone, passing through one man to hit the man behind him. The first wave crumpled. But the horror of the Gyokusai was that the enemy didn't care. They didn't dive for cover when the tracers snapped past their heads. They simply stepped over the bodies of the fallen and kept running. O'Neill traversed the gun left, hitting the wooden crossing stick, then swept right. He was mowing the grass, but the grass kept growing back. The psychological toll was heavier than the recoil. O'Neill was a mechanic. He understood cause and effect. In the factory, if something broke, you stopped the line. Here, the line wouldn't stop. He saw men with missing arms charging. He saw officers waving swords, running directly into the muzzle flash as if trying to catch the bullets. The gun began to protest. The cosmoline and oil on the barrel started to cook off, rising in a plume of acrid, gray smoke that stung O'Neill's eyes. The receiver grew hot to the touch. The vibration rattled his teeth. Miller, the loader, was frantically pulling the empty cloth belt through the feed tray, his hands slick with sweat and grime, reaching for the next box. The first 250 rounds were gone in less than 2 minutes. The barrel was already heating up, expanding microscopically, changing the friction coefficient. O'Neill slammed the bolt forward on a fresh belt. The red flare was fading, but the screaming was getting louder. The first wave had been a shock, but the second wave was bringing something heavier than spears, and it was dialing in on the muzzle flash of O'Neill's gun. At 0445 hours, the dynamic of the battle shifted from a brawl to a bombardment. The Japanese support troops in the rear began dropping 50mm shells from Type 89 knee mortars into the American line. They didn't need precise coordinates. They just walked the fire toward the muzzle flashes. One round landed just outside the sandbag wall of Hell's Pocket. The concussion was like a hammer blow to the chest, collapsing part of the trench. When the dust settled, O'Neill looked to his left. PFC Miller was gone, slumped over a box of .30-06 ammo, a piece of shrapnel having found the gap in his helmet. O'Neill didn't scream. He didn't mourn. In the logic of the assembly line, a component had failed and the system had to compensate. He was now the gunner, the loader, and the commander. The efficiency of the crew-served weapon evaporated instantly. To reload, O'Neill had to take his hand off the trigger, pop the latch on the top cover, heave the steel lid open, rake the empty belt out, align a fresh 250-round belt into the feed tray, slam the cover down, and rack the bolt. What used to take 4 seconds now took 10. 10 seconds is an eternity when men with bayonets are sprinting toward you at 15 miles per hour. He fell into a frantic, solitary rhythm. Fire. Burst. Burst. Empty. He clawed at the belts, his fingers slipping on the brass casings. The gun was spitting hot spent cartridges directly into the confined space of the foxhole. They piled up around his legs, searing his skin through his dungarees, but he didn't feel the heat. The gas blowback from the muzzle was filling the depression with toxic fumes, choking him, making his eyes water until the enemy soldiers were just blurry shapes in the gray dawn. Down in the ravine, Captain Sato had identified the problem. The American line was buckling, but it hadn't broken. One specific point of resistance, a single rhythmic stutter of automatic fire, was chewing up his center ranks. Sato realized this wasn't a squad. It was one stubborn position holding back the tide. He grabbed a squad leader and pointed his sword toward the relentless muzzle flash. "Silence that gun," he ordered. "Don't charge it. Kill the operator." The tactics changed immediately. The human wave thinned out, replaced by crawlers and throwers. Dark, round objects began arcing through the air, Type 97 hand grenades. One landed on the parapet. O'Neill kicked it instinctively, sending it tumbling down the slope just as it detonated. Another exploded yards away, sending hot jagged steel singing past his ear. Shrapnel bit into his left shoulder, stinging like a swarm of hornets, but O'Neill locked his muscles and kept his traverse smooth. He was bleeding, he was choking, and he was alone. But as he reached for the next ammo box, his hand recoiled. The steel receiver of the M1919 was radiating heat like a furnace door. The gun wasn't just hot, it was dying. The metal was expanding, and the physics of the weapon were about to collide with the laws of thermodynamics. By 0515 hours, the battle had devolved into a contest of thermodynamics. The M1919A4 was no longer a weapon, it was a hazard. In the gray pre-dawn light, the barrel inside the perforated cooling jacket was glowing a dull, translucent cherry red. The steel had absorbed so much thermal energy that the molecular structure was beginning to soften. O'Neill knew the physics of what came next. If he chambered a round and didn't fire it immediately, the ambient heat of the chamber would ignite the primer, a cook-off. The gun would either start firing uncontrollably on its own or worse, the cartridge would detonate before the bolt was fully locked, sending shrapnel into O'Neill's face. The gun needed to cool, but O'Neill had no water. His canteen was empty, drained hours ago in the humidity. The spare water cans for the squad were buried under the collapsed trench wall where Miller had died. O'Neill looked at the glowing metal, then at the jungle where the shadows were moving again. He made a desperate, utilitarian calculation. Standing up in the exposure of the foxhole, risking a sniper's bullet, he unbuttoned his fly. He relieved himself directly onto the sizzling barrel jacket. The liquid hit the white-hot steel and instantly vaporized into a cloud of foul-smelling steam. It was a gritty, humiliating act of survival, but as the steam cleared, the red glow dulled to a dark gray. The metal contracted. The machine was back in the fight. It happened just in time because Captain Sato had changed the game. The massive Banzai waves had stopped. Sato realized that massed infantry was just meat for the grinder. Instead, he deployed the Nikaku, human bullets. These were not soldiers looking for combat, they were delivery systems for high explosives. Men strapped with satchel charges, Type 99 magnetic mines, and clusters of grenades broke from the tree line. They didn't scream. They didn't fire rifles. They sprinted with terrifying singular purpose, their eyes locked on O'Neill's sandbags. O'Neill could no longer rely on the beaten zone, or wide traversing fire. He had to become a sniper with a machine gun. He had to engage in snap aiming, physically manhandling the tripod to jerk the heavy barrel toward individual runners. Pop, pop, pop. One runner dropped at 40 yards, the explosives on his chest detonating in a sympathetic blast that shook the ground. Pop, pop, pop. Another runner zigzagged, making it to within 20 yards before O'Neill walked to burst up his legs and into his chest. The margin for error was gone. If a single runner made it to the trench, O'Neill and the entire flank were erased. His forearms were cramping, his vision blurring from the toxic mix of propellant gas and steam. He dropped a runner carrying a lunge mine just 10 feet from the muzzle. The explosion showered O'Neill with dirt and debris, ringing his ears until the world was nothing but a high-pitched whine. He shook the dirt from the receiver and reached for his ammo box. His hand hit the bottom. He pulled up the belt. It was light. Too light. As the sun began to crest the horizon, illuminating the carnage in front of him, O'Neill realized the terrifying truth. He had 2 belts left, the gun was jamming, and from the smoke of the tree line, a figure was walking, not running, toward him, holding a katana that caught the first light of dawn. At 0545 hours, the sun finally betrayed them both. The dawn light washed over the Tanapag plain, stripping away the protective ambiguity of the night. For the first time, O'Neill could see the full extent of the horror. The ground in front of his position wasn't just uneven terrain. It was carpeted with bodies, a grim topography of fallen soldiers that stretched back into the jungle. But O'Neill didn't have time to process the carnage. He was looking at his ammunition. 2 belts. 500 rounds. In the world of the M1919A4, that was less than 60 seconds of life. Then the smoke parted. The frenzied screaming stopped, replaced by a strange rhythmic chanting from the tree line. Captain Hiroshi Sato emerged. He wasn't running. He wasn't screaming. He was walking, stepping deliberately over the dead with the eerie calm of a man who has already accepted his own ghost. In his right hand, the sunlight caught the steel of his family's katana, the blade held high. Behind him walked a final squad of elite troops, the remnants of the command staff. They moved with him, a slow-moving wall of finality. O'Neill swung the barrel toward Sato's chest. He exhaled, centering the front blade sight. He depressed the trigger. Click. The gun didn't fire. It wasn't a misfire, it was a catastrophic failure. The extreme heat had caused a cartridge case to rupture inside the superheated chamber. The brass had split, leaving a jagged sleeve of metal fused to the chamber walls, blocking the next round. The gun was dead. O'Neill froze. Sato was 40 yards away and closing. The walking turned into a jog. The jog turned into a sprint. The sword raised higher. Panic is a luxury, O'Neill relied on training. He ripped the top cover open. Smoke billowed into his face. He could see the brass obstruction. He couldn't clear it with the bolt. He needed a tool. He grabbed his K-bar fighting knife from his belt. He jammed the tip of the blade into the glowing chamber, trying to hook the lip of the broken casing. 30 yards. O'Neill's fingers brushed against the receiver walls. The steel was over 500 degrees. The skin on his knuckles sizzled and blistered instantly, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the cordite. He screamed, not in fear but in sheer agonizing effort. He twisted the knife. 20 yards. Sato was screaming now, a primal war cry. The brass casing popped loose, pinging off O'Neill's helmet. He didn't check the chamber. He slammed the top cover down with his bleeding hand and racked the bolt. Clack clack. 10 yards. He could see the sweat on Sato's face. He could see the temper line on the katana. O'Neill didn't aim. He just held the trigger down. The M1919 roared, spitting flame. At point-blank range, the physics were absolute. The burst caught Sato mid-stride, the heavy .30 caliber rounds lifting the officer off his feet and stopping the charge instantly. The elite squad behind him disintegrated into the beaten zone. O'Neill didn't let go. He held the trigger until the belt ran dry, the tail end of the cloth whipping into the receiver. The gun went silent. The echo of the last shot rolled off the cliffs and faded. But as the smoke drifted away, revealing the pile of bodies just feet from his sandbags, O'Neill realized that the silence was louder than the gunfire had ever been, and in that ringing quiet, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. At 0600 hours, the war simply turned off. The deafening roar of the M1919A4, which had defined the last 2 hours of existence, cut out abruptly, leaving a vacuum in the air that was physically painful to the ears. The only sound remaining in Hell's Pocket was the angry rhythmic hissing of the cooling gun. The barrel, now a blackened, crusty tube of steel, ticked and pinged as the metal contracted in the morning air. Sergeant O'Neill sat slumped against the sandbags, his legs buried under a drift of hot brass casings that reached his knees. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing rhythmically. He was staring at the receiver of the gun with the 1,000-yard stare of a man whose soul has left his body. His hands were still locked around the pistol grip, the tendons standing out like wire cables. The heat and the adrenaline had caused a muscular tetany. His fingers were clawed shut, fused to the Parkerized steel as if the man and the machine had finally welded into a single organism. Minutes later, the footsteps from behind materialized into a patrol from the reserve platoon. A young lieutenant slid into the depression, weapon raised, expecting a firefight. Instead, he lowered his carbine slowly, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked at O'Neill, then he looked over the sandbags. The lieutenant opened his mouth to give an order, but no sound came out. The scene in front of the gun defied military logic. It looked less like a battlefield and more like an industrial accident. The bodies weren't scattered, they were stacked. The sheer density of the assault meant that the dead had fallen upon the dead, creating a grotesque ramp of humanity that rose nearly to the height of the gun muzzle. The beaten zone O'Neill had engineered was paved with the enemy. It was a carpet of khaki and red, stretching back 40 yards into the jungle scrub. The air smelled of sulfur, copper, and the sickly sweet scent of crushed vegetation. The reinforcements moved forward cautiously, stepping through the carnage with a mixture of horror and reverence. They began the grim task of checking the perimeter, their boots slipping in the mud created by blood and morning dew. Just 15 feet from the muzzle, 5 short yards, a corporal stopped and whistled low. "Check this," he whispered. Lying face down, his uniform shredded by the final point-blank burst, was Captain Hiroshi Sato. His hand was still gripping the hilt of the family katana, his knuckles white even in death. He had crossed 300 yards of open ground, through a storm of lead that had leveled a forest, only to die 5 paces from his objective. It was a warrior's death, archaic and terrifying in its futility. The lieutenant looked from Sato's body back to O'Neill, measuring the distance. 5 yards. That was the margin between life and death. 2 seconds of sprinting, 1 jams of a gun. The medics arrived and had to physically pry O'Neill's fingers from the weapon, one by one. The skin of his palms was burned black, and his dungarees were soaked through with sweat and oil. They loaded him onto a stretcher, but as they carried him away from the steaming gun and the mountain of dead, the full weight of the morning's arithmetic hadn't yet been tallied. The body count was beginning, and the numbers were about to reveal a statistical impossibility that would haunt military historians for decades. The official count began at 0700 hours. Intelligence officers and graves registration units moved through the tall grass of Hell's Pocket with clipboards, stepping carefully over the debris of the charge. The final tally was staggering. Lying within the traverse limits of Sergeant O'Neill's tripod were 342 confirmed enemy dead. It was a number that defied the conventional ratios of infantry combat. A single position, manned by a single Marine for the final hour, had effectively liquidated an entire battalion. O'Neill wasn't there to see the count. He was in the rear aid station, his hands swathed in heavy gauze, his face a mask of soot and dried sweat. The regimental surgeon treated him for second-degree burns on his palms and fingers, the result of prying the ruptured casing from the superheated chamber. Officers came to his cot, speaking in hushed tones about the Navy Cross, perhaps even the Medal of Honor. They called him a hero. They called him the Iron Man of Saipan. O'Neill didn't look up. He stared at his bandaged hands, trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. When a colonel congratulated him on his bravery, O'Neill shook his head slowly. "They were brave," he whispered, his voice raspy from the smoke. "I just ran the machine. They just ran into the math." Thomas O'Neill survived the war, but he left the Marine Corps the moment his discharge papers were signed. He never touched a firearm again. He returned to Detroit, back to the rhythm of the River Rouge plant. He spent the next 40 years building engines for Ford, finding comfort in the predictable, logical noise of the assembly line. He was a good mechanic. He raised a family. He went to church. But his wife would later say that on humid July nights, he would wake up sweating, staring into the dark corner of the bedroom as if waiting for a red flare. He wasn't afraid of death. He was haunted by the image of Captain Sato's face, the eyes of a man who knew he was running into a buzzsaw but ran anyway. This story isn't just about a man, it's about the cold mathematics of war. It demonstrates how a single M1919A4 machine gun, when placed in the perfect enfilade position and operated by a technician who refuses to break, can negate the willpower of an army. It forces us to acknowledge the terrifying reality of the human wave and the grim respect due to an adversary like Captain Sato, whose loyalty to his emperor was absolute, even when it demanded his suicide. Victory in battle isn't about glory, and it isn't about hatred. It is often just a matter of friction, heat management, and the will to keep the bolt cycling when every instinct screams at you to run. Sergeant O'Neill held the line not because he hated what was in front of him, but because he loved what was behind him. Sergeant O'Neill literally burned the skin off his hands to hold that line. His fingers were locked to that trigger for 2 hours, paralyzed by heat and duty, just so the men behind him could go home. It takes less than 1 second of effort for you to move your finger and hit that subscribe button. Don't let a man who gave that much be forgotten by an algorithm just because you didn't think his story was worth a click. Hit the like, subscribe, and comment, "Held the line," to show you remember.